Hey guys, we just got our penultimate episode of Season 1 of The Rings of Power. And while the episode is called The Eye, it's all about the fallout from last week's explosive ending. We've got some big moments to talk about, including a shocking character revealed in dialogue that raises even more questions for this show. Now real quick, if you're not already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you get all kinds of Tolkien deep dives in your feed each and every week from Nerd of the Rings. We open with Galadriel waking in the aftermath of last week's eruption of Mount Doom. She stands up disoriented and everything is covered with fire and ash, including a burning horse, which along with the design of this entire post-apocalyptic set was pretty awesome. Galadriel comes across Theo and they head off on their own path. Meanwhile, some folks are actually being helpful, like Isildur, who helps Valandil out from under a fallen building. Unfortunately, as we predicted would happen sooner rather than later, Ontimo is a goner. Isildur next goes to help out some folks in a burning building, and in the subsequent collapse, he appears to be lost, and Miriel gets a face full of burning coals. Cut to the Harfoots, who find the grove, which has seen the effects of Mount Doom as well. We see a few craters from rock thrown from Mount Doom, and it's wreaked havoc on the apple trees. The stranger goes up to one of the trees and you can tell he seems really distraught by the death of the trees. He says invignata and lote na. We saw in the last episode Meteor Man uses invignata, which means renew or heal, when he was healing his own arm and it froze over. Lote translates to flower. While this is going on, Sadok and Marva go back and forth about trees talking, and it's obviously a reference to Ents. But like the Harfoot reference to people being turned into stars, it just feels a bit forced, so the audience will say, "Oh, they're talking about that thing I know." The stranger starts shouting "Ai kuita," which appears to be him commanding the tree to live or awake. As we discussed during the watch party, the way this plays out and the stranger's seeming affinity for trees could point toward him actually being Radagast, as he was a servant of Yavanna and was known for his care of plants and animals. We cut back to Khazad-dûm, where Elrond requests from King Durin III access to the Mithril mines in exchange for the elves supplying game, grain, and timber for the next 500 years. When a couple dwarves wonder in Khazad-dûm if they can keep their promise, Elrond answers that he's never made a promise he couldn't keep. And when Durin III asks why he should trust an elf, Elrond says he shouldn't trust just any elf, and he is half-elven and can see in elves what they cannot see in themselves. And I really like these moments as Elrond requests help of the king. It shows a very wise and noble Elrond, and I continue to really enjoy this character. Now, I didn't mention it in an earlier breakdown, but as we see Durin III and Durin IV speak privately, we see what I believe to be the famous Axe of Durin that was known to be kept in Khazad-dûm in its heyday. We get another name drop of Aule, the smith of the Valar who created the dwarves, and the father and son argue about helping the elves. Durin III says the elves' fate was decided many ages ago by minds far greater than their own. And I think he's referring to the Valar here, because he's speaking in the plural form, though speaking of the One, or Eru, would have made more sense in my opinion. He also implies that if they defy the will of the Valar, the entire kingdom might fall, which seems pretty on the nose for the whole warning about delving for Mithril leading to a Balrog thing. I hope they don't change the story surrounding this so it becomes like a Wrath of the Valar type thing, instead of just a result of the dwarves' greed. We get some more nice banter between Durin and Disa as they vent about the king's decision. It's kind of crazy that this is the first married couple we've seen really interact for more than a brief moment in a Middle-earth adaptation, and it's a fun dynamic they've got going. When Elrond arrives and learns the news, Durin tries to elbow him into staying for dinner, which shows how far their relationship has come since the days when Durin was so upset with him in episode 2. And we next get a moment when Durin realizes Elrond will have to leave Middle-earth, and that this is likely the last time he will ever see him. Elrond says that they don't say goodbye, but namarie, which means more than farewell, but go towards goodness. And this scene is honestly just more proof that if there is a character who is the beating heart of this show, it's Durin. There's just so many moments, whether it's humor at tricking the elves out of a table, to his anger with his father, to his sorrow at losing his friend, where he's such an easy character to connect with and feel the way he feels. Each and every episode just solidifies the Khazad-dûm arc, and Durin and Elrond in particular as the best of the show. Durin throws the Mithril across the table, which heals the sickened leaf, and he calls for his friend to come back. So this pretty much confirms that Mithril does indeed have magical healing properties of some kind. I suppose there's still a chance that the whole Balrog elf tree origin story is made up, but the book nerd in me, at this point, is working really hard to just roll my eyes and move on from the Mithril miracle or saving the elves from certain death thing. Back in Ashtown, Galadriel and Theo view some orcs, and while Theo wants to go in guns a-blazing, Galadriel says this Shadowland is dead, and that they must rally to the living. And it was kind of nice to hear this because thus far Galadriel has been pretty eager to go in guns a-blazing. Back with the Numenorians, we find Elendil has survived, and is likewise caked in ash. Then we get the reveal that Isildur's horse, Beric, survived as well, who at this point is going to be like the Bill the Pony of the show. How can you not love a good horse character? Isildur doesn't return, but Miriel and Valandil do, who presumably tell Elendil of his son's apparent death. Back to Galadriel and Theo, which is an interesting pairing of characters and gives us a chance to hear some things coming from Galadriel that sound like Galadriel. What cannot be known hollows the mind, fill it not with guesswork. And it darkens the heart to call dark deeds good. I'm hoping that this is coming from a place where Galadriel has learned the error of her ways, and is reminding herself of truths she once knew because just last episode, she was kinda sounding like a raging psychopath. Back with Miriel, we discover that she has been blinded by the coals earlier, and Elendil and Valandil on her command continue to lead her horse so people won't notice. This brings to mind the earlier prophecy when her father Tar Palantir declared that all she would find in Middle-earth was darkness. Back with the Harfoots, and Sadok points Meteor Man toward Greenwood the Great. This forest of course would be called Mirkwood in the later Third Age, after Sauron makes it his home for a time in Dol Guldur. If we take a look at the map of Middle-earth, we can also see that the explosive effects of Mount Doom likely reached quite far from the lands of Mordor. While these obviously aren't a wasteland like the area of Gorgoroth, the debris of Mount Doom made it nearly to Greenwood. We then see a single flower begin to bloom out of the dead tree, and the stranger gets an apple for the road from Nori as he heads on his way. Back with Theo and Galadriel, and Theo asks Galadriel if she's ever lost someone to orcs, and she reveals Finrod, which I think we all expected. But then she drops the bombshell that her husband Celeborn went to war and never returned. There's a lot to unpack and theorize here, so we'll take it a point at a time. First off, no, I don't think Celeborn is actually dead. It wouldn't make the slightest bit of sense for Celeborn to be dead, so I think this is a fake out and Galadriel just believes him to be dead. That being said, I could see the show swapping Celeborn for a fan favorite character who is no stranger to being omitted. Glorfindel, who was replaced by Arwen in the Peter Jackson Fellowship of the Ring adaptation, was an elf whose self-sacrifice earned him a speedy re-embodiment by the Valar. He was then one of the only elves ever to be re-embodied and returned to Middle-earth. Glorfindel returns to Middle-earth around 1600 of the Second Age, around the same time the Blue Wizards appear. Now what I could see the show doing is truly having Celeborn be dead, but having him taking Glorfindel's place and being re-embodied and sent back to Middle-earth. It would somewhat explain why he's apparently been missing for 1,000 years after the war, with nobody having seen him. Personally, I'd rather meet Glorfindel, because he's awesome. But regardless, there's about as much chance of Celeborn being dead as Isildur being dead. You're not fooling anyone. Another note is Galadriel says Celeborn's armor didn't fit right and she called him a silver clam. The name Celeborn features the word Celeb, which means silver, with his full name meaning silver tall. Theo and Galadriel go on to talk about taking on the blame themselves for the victory of darkness we saw in the previous episode. And again, I thought this was some nice change of pace for Galadriel, who has been pretty foolish and honestly unlikable for most of the show for me. However, here, like the last episode with the Isildur, she shows glimpses of the Galadriel I think more of us expected. We'll see how this plays out in the finale, but it's definitely an improvement for now. Galadriel and Theo have a moment reminiscent of the Hobbits and the Nazgul when a group of orcs walk overhead. We also get the same line as the Uruk-hai in the Two Towers with, "What is it? What do you smell?" But this time it is answered with, "Nothing but ashes." Back in Khazad-dûm, Elrond and Durin continue to be awesome as they attempt to mine for Mithril themselves. Within the nice banter, Elrond implies that Durin's grandfather was also named Durin, and Durin says that they have secret names amongst themselves that they reveal only to family. And it seems as though he's about to tell Elrond his true name when Elrond tells him to save it for the far side. Now, I've long said I didn't care for the fact that we are having simultaneous Durins in this show, because of the Dwarven belief that the name Durin was only given to those who were so alike to the original Durin that they were believed to be the reincarnation of the original himself. Thus, having simultaneous Durins is pretty lame because it ignores this part of their culture. I really don't know what to make of this, but I'm curious to see what becomes of it. It almost makes me wonder if during this time in Khazad-dûm's history, that they say all the males of the royal line are Durin to outsiders. Just as they find massive roots of Mithril that wind their way throughout the mountain, King Durin interrupts and kicks Elrond out of Khazad-dûm. The two Durins have it out in a heated exchange, and we see Durin III truly lose his temper for the first time, when his son says Elrond is as much a brother to him as if he were born of his mother's womb. I must say I enjoyed this development and this argument as it felt like a natural escalation of this relationship. It felt truly earned as these feelings have been simmering and gradually coming to a head. The next morning in the grove, we discovered that the stranger healed the entire area, and there's all kinds of apples for the harfoots. Soon after, we see how the hobbits do their disappearing act as the three mystics show up, on the trail of Meteor Man. My best guess is still that they are some kind of Morgoth worshippers, who are also sorceresses. They burn the Harfoot carts and we cut back to the Numenorians. Here we find Beric is upset, and Elendil tries to calm him in a scene that seems a bit like when Aragorn calms Brego in the Two Towers. And like Aragorn, his ancestor Elendil sets the horse free. If I were a betting man, I'd guess Beric will go find Isildur and help him find his way somewhere. Elendil says he should have never pulled the elf on board. And this was quite a surprise, as I thought Elendil was firmly in the faithful camp after the white tree leaves falling and such. But it looks like we may have some more conflict in his future than I might have expected. Hopefully Elendil doesn't go too dark in this regard. In my opinion, he should never actually side with the King's men, though I'd understand if he were tempted, and maybe Isildur will play a role in cementing his father as a man of the faithful. Theo and Galadriel arrive, and for the second straight episode we get a Bronwyn death fake out. I'm pretty sure if you do it a third time the character has to actually be dead. Them's the rules. Theo and Arondir share a nice hug as they're reunited as well. Next, Galadriel meets with Mithril, and as Elendil says, "Let us put this land behind our sails," I could definitely sense some compelling righteous anger. Mithril tells Galadriel to save her pity and that their enemies do not know what they have begun. Mithril makes a vow for Numenor to return, in doing so naming herself as a daughter of Ar-Inziladun. Now, as we've said previously, vows and oaths have power in Tolkien's world. Just as we are given hints of when Elrond and Durin swore on the rock, oaths are not made to be lightly thrown aside in Middle-earth. They have consequences. Just ask the Oathbreakers, the dead men of Dunharrow. Also interesting here is the use of her father's Adunaic name, Ar-Inziladun. Especially given she is making a vow to an elf, I would have expected her to say Tar Palantir, rather than the naming convention adopted by those who harbored hatred for the elves. We see Elendil turn his back on Mithril and become distraught. And I don't know, but it just feels like the shot selection here is very awkward, and does this scene no favors. What is meant to be a very emotional moment where Elendil breaks feels distant and just awkward. I immediately thought of one of my favorite emotional scenes of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where Theoden weeps over the death of his son. Watch that scene and then watch this one and you'll get what I mean. Both have fathers overcome with grief, and both even have someone looking on, but one is incredibly well shot and executed and the other is just not. Back with the Harfoots, Nori decides to go help the stranger. And because the Frodo stand-in can't go without a Sam stand-in, Poppy volunteers too. And if we're going that far, we might as well go the whole way and make it 4 hobbits, and include a paraphrased version of Not Going Anywhere Without Me. So the Harfoots set out for Meteor Man and the Numenorians sail for home. Meanwhile, the Southlanders are heading to the Numenorian colony of Pelargir. Pelargir will later become an important port in Gondor, and is the location where Aragorn and the Army of the Dead scare off the Corsairs of Umbar during the War of the Ring. We also find out Halbrand was found on the road, and it looks like he's been stabbed. Galadriel, again in a moment that reminds us of Fellowship of the Ring, says he needs elvish medicine. Halbrand says it isn't over, and he won't abandon the Southlands and condemn them to burn. Which, as we've been maintaining this guy on our Sauron watch, is a pretty non-Sauron thing to say. But for all we know, he could have self-inflicted his wound in order to gain entry into Elven lands and is totally just BSing. Who knows at this point? Though the King of the Dead theory is growing on me as well. Back in Khazad-dûm, Disa says one day Durin will be king, and they will rule together, and they will dig. I was a bit surprised because I thought perhaps Durin would be the one gung-ho about mining Mithril, and Disa would caution against it. But I wonder if this might be the other way around eventually. We'll see how this Mithril business plays out, I suppose. Another curious thing is Disa mentions Durin's brother. He's not been mentioned at all whatsoever, so it makes me wonder if we'll see him come into play. Kind of a crazy little tidbit thrown in there. Back with Durin III, he throws the healed linden leaf through the hole made by his son earlier, and he tells his dwarves to seal it up. The leaf floats ever downward until it lands in the depths of the mountain, and we get the Balrog shot from the Comic-Con trailer, as it seems really ticked that someone just littered in his home. Now, I was really hoping we wouldn't see the fall of Khazad-dûm in this series. It would be moving it up incredibly far in the timeline, and while it would no doubt be an epic event to see, I worry it would take away from some good potential story moments with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm being in the last alliance. I'd like to believe the showrunners when they mentioned earlier that there was plenty to tell in the Second Age without pulling things in from the Third, but I can't help but think this was them deflecting. Hopefully I'm wrong and this is just a cameo, but showing this Balrog in the depths of Khazad-dûm feels like it could be a Chekhov's gun moment. You don't include the Balrog in this big of a shot if you don't intend to use it later. Back in the lands formerly known as South, Adar says Southlands is the name of a place that no longer exists, and the Southlands fades on screen, then is replaced by Mordor, which incidentally is a Sindarin word that translates to Black Land. Is this transition on the nose? Extremely so. But I have to say I do love this shot of Mount Doom continuing to billow smoke. It definitely feels like a barren wasteland riddled with fire and ash. Personally, I think a better reveal of the name would have been them using one of their cool map transitions, with Mount Doom transitioning to the map, then for the name Mordor to appear across the lands on the map itself. I'm not sure how they choose when to use the map and when not to, but I think this would have been a good point to use it. And with that, we are now down to one episode remaining in the entire first season of Rings of Power. I must say I'm curious what will be in store for us in episode 8, and quite honestly a bit frustrated that I have little to no idea what to expect. I've gone into season finales before knowing unexpected things could happen, but it seems like the audience should have a bit more of an idea than we currently do. In my mind, a conflict between the stranger and the mystics is the only thing I have a good feeling about. I'm sure there'll be something to deal with Khazad-dûm or Durin or Elrond that I'll find delightful as always, but the other storylines seem to be in travel mode, so it's hard to say what will happen in this last episode. Hopefully we'll get some much needed answers to questions that have been posed throughout the season, as it's high time some of these mysteries were solved. Overall, I really enjoyed seeing a bit more wisdom and kindness and a bit less brash stupidity out of Galadriel, and hopefully it will stick going forward. The Durin Elrond Khazad-dûm storyline continues to be where the show is at its best. Now we'll be back next week for the finale, but in the meantime, let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Kella Brimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mob's Music, CCDC Red Team, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darracott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.